Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Financial Health Virtual Community Meeting. Our meeting today will be focused on the drivers of financial health, and I'm looking forward to having a rich conversation about that. But before we get started, so we're going to put a poll up on the screen to better understand who we're talking with today. So I'm putting up a poll now on stakeholder type, what you most identify with in terms of how you self-identify your role in the industry. So are you in the government, public sector? Are you private sector? Are you part of a development organization? Are you in academia or a think tank or something else? I realize that these categories are not always exhaustive, and you might self-identify as another place or two of these, but please make your best guess. Looks like we have about 75% participation. That's great. Thank you all, and we're going to close the poll now, and let's see who we're talking with today. Looks like we have very few people from government or public sector, about a third from private sector, a third from development organizations, about 25% who identify as other, so we'll have to figure out who that is in our discussion. I do know there might be a couple people from public sector who've joined us who might not have self-identified that way. And let's put up a second poll on the primary geographic focus of your work so we can try to tailor our discussion. And this is not necessarily where you're calling from right now or where you're based, but where is the focus of your work? We've put up 5 categories here. Again, really not exhaustive, but Asia and the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, global or other. I'm assuming that other would probably mean Eastern Europe if you're calling from there. I know we have a few people from Eastern Europe. So go ahead and make that selection. It looks like many of you have voted. Let's go ahead and close that poll. And a lot of global and other, which tells me that we need to better tool these quizzes. But some whose focus is in Latin America and the Caribbean, and some whose focus is in Asia and the Pacific. Looks like we don't have anybody just at this point calling in from Sub-Saharan Africa. This is really helpful as we tailor our discussion. Well, welcome again, and let me go over a couple housekeeping details. We've muted all of you just for the sake of noise control, but we will call on you as you raise your hand. Let's put up a little picture of what that looks like, what the screen looks like on the webinar platform. There's a little icon of a hand, and you can click that if you want to raise your hand. Or if you want to ask a question, there's a question box that'll be in the drop-down questions menu. And so I hope you'll take advantage of those tools, because we certainly want this to be an interactive discussion. We don't have a huge crowd today on purpose. This is not a webinar that we blast our whole distribution list. This is a very targeted group of people that we invite to join this. And so I hope that you will consider this to be a discussion and not just a presentation. You can also use the chat function to ask questions of us or troubleshoot your technology. We are going to be recording this session, but only to share it among those who wanted to participate but weren't able to. And I wanted to also note that there's a handouts section of your webinar software that currently has 4 handouts. These are reports that we're anticipating might be mentioned today, things that the financial health community told us were reports that have come out in the last few months, so you might want to take a look at that. We're going to be doing a deep dive on the third one, the determinants of financial health and well-being in Latin America, and we have some special guests to talk about that today. For those of you calling in by phone without any of these features, please feel free to be in touch with us. You can respond directly to the invitation email you received or ping us on social media. Tess Johnson, who's here with me in the office, is the one who's calling on folks, and so you can reach out to her, tjohnson@axion.org, if you're having trouble with your sound or if you want to make a comment. and we'll try to integrate you into the conversation. I realize that you have reduced functionality by calling in by phone. Well, let me go ahead and introduce myself, and I'm going to turn on my webcam. I know that sometimes it can be hard in a virtual meeting or a by phone or by computer meeting to have some context for who you're talking with and who's leading the discussion and what's going on. So I'm turning on my webcam so you can see me and I can say hello. I'm Sonia Kelly, the Director of Research at the Center for Financial Inclusion. Let me introduce you to the folks in our office as well. This is Tess Johnson. I told you she's the one who is going to be monitoring the comments and answering your questions as it relates to what's been talked about. So some of the questions she receives are even things like, who is it that's talking right now? What organization are they from? Can I be connected with them? And so beyond just saying, I want to make a comment, you can ask her contextual things about what's happening in our webinar. We have Neil here as well. He's troubleshooting the technical difficulties that we might have, but knock on wood, will not be having. And then we have Beth Ryan joining us as well. Most of you know her, and she might be chiming in as she has ideas. Let me just talk a little bit about our conversation first, and then I'm going to turn off my webcam and we're going to focus on these discussion questions that I've put up here. So our conversation today will focus on the deployment of the concept of financial health. We've had these meetings about every 3 or 4 months for the last 9 or 10 months. I think we started almost a year ago, and we've been focusing on the framework for financial health, the idea of financial health, but today we really want to focus on the deployment part. So I mentioned that we're going to have some special guests and that are going to be doing a deep dive on their research relevant to this topic. This is a group of researchers in Colombia. So after our discussion, I'm going to turn to them because they really do have answers to these questions in our discussion that we're going to start with. You might also hear from people today with whom you want to be connected, who are using the concept of financial health in their work. And like I said, we're happy to serve as a matchmaker to that end. So please feel free to send us a message either during the webinar or afterwards, and we're happy to connect you. For us here at CFI, this question of how to deploy financial health is a very relevant one. We worked with CFSI a couple of years ago to look at the Kenya and India context and understand better whether financial health could be used in an emerging market concept. And the answer to that question was unequivocally yes. But the question of how to use it is still one that we're thinking actively about. We're working with Microfinance Center in Poland to try to operationalize the concept of financial health into a quiz that's relevant for people in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. So for me, this topic is one that is really going to influence my work. Our discussion is really going to influence how we think about it. So I'm going to turn off my webcam at this point because I don't want the focus to be on me. There are a lot of us here today, and I'd like to instead of starting with a presentation, start with a discussion. I put up these 3 questions, and anywhere you want to weigh in on these 3, we'd be happy to start to dig in there. So let me read these questions out. What first, in your experience, drives financial health? Either from anecdotal evidence that you've seen or from research experience. What have you seen driving financial health? Second, how have you employed these hypotheses in your projects and investments? And third, what are some outstanding questions you continue to have? I love the honesty in this community, recognizing that there are a lot of outstanding questions we have. We don't have financial health all figured out. It's really clear that it's a concept that has great resonance, but we still have a lot of things to work on and figure out as we move forward with it. So if you want to weigh in, like I said, we've muted everyone for the sake of volume control, but you have a little a hand icon. You can raise your hand, or you can put a comment or question in the chat window. And I'm going to just be okay with a little bit of awkward silence while we wait. But it looks like Leonard has raised his hand. Leonard, let's open the line to you. And Leonard, sorry, we're opening up your line now. And would love to have you weigh in on these questions. Leonard, can you test your sound with us and say something?
Hello?
Hi, perfect, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. My name is Leonard from CENFRI, the Center for Financial Regulation and Inclusion in Cape Town. So we've been working a lot in the area of financial health, but we are focusing on financial outcomes. So our starting point in the area of financial health was we interrogated the question of why people use financial services. So our hypothesis is that people do not own financial products for the sake of owning them. They engage with financial services to meet specific needs. So using the Maslow hierarchy of needs, we sort of populated the needs people need to meet using financial services. And to us, the concept of financial health leans mostly on whether or not those financial needs have been met. So we have a bucket of 4 needs that people need to meet using financial services, which are resilience needs. This is mainly catered for by the insurance market. Then we have liquidity needs relating to meeting day-to-day expenses. This is met by a combination of product markets that people engage with. Then we have the meeting goals needs, which is also facilitated by a combination of financial products, mainly credit, savings, and so on, to meet large expensive goals that people would like to meet. Then we also have a transfer value need, which relates to the ease at which people can transact in the market. So the concept of financial health is, to us, is largely dependent on whether or not these needs in the market are met. So this is the work that we have been doing for the past 2 years, trying to come up with what are the outcomes of financial services usage that contribute to financial health. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. And I'm going to keep you on if that's okay. I'd love to ask a follow-up question. So CENFRI, it sounds like you're proceeding with the assumption that financial products that meet financial needs drive financial health. I sort of see a causal chain in my mind. That sounds ideal, certainly. I'd love to ask about some of the, like whether there are other factors that you've seen that are also drivers of financial health that almost limit the effectiveness of financial products meeting financial needs, driving financial health. So let me give you an example. What about somebody who's very low income? For them, is it still the same causal chain?
The way we have been approaching our research problem has been dwelling mostly on the needs framework that we produced in the past. So we are doing work on which is also an all-encompassing, but this is trying to answer what drives financial services usage in itself. So for us, the issue of low income is a usage problem. It's not really an outcomes problem. So our starting point is without usage of financial services, there are no outcomes. So the issue of low income would be what drives the usage of financial services. These are the contextual factors that affect the way in which people engage with financial services. After engaging with financial services, the approximate outcomes that are coming from that direct usage of financial services. So it's sort of a 2-layer approach where we're trying to understand what drives financial services usage and what drives outcomes of financial services usage. Yeah.
Thanks, Leonard. I'd love to open up the line now to Gerard Kotze. Gerard, I don't know if you didn't raise your hand, but you were asking a question in the chat box, so I hope that means that you're paying attention, that I'm not just calling on you out of the blue. But Gerard, I know this is a question that you've had as well as from the CGAP perspective. You've thought about how to operationalize and contextualize financial health in customer centricity and customer outcomes. So I'd love to turn to you now, either to build on some of the ways that Leonard is thinking about this, or introduce your own questions or thoughts. Gerard?
Good morning. Sonia, let me be quick about this. We are struggling with this concept of the role of financial services within the broader lives of people, and at CGAP thinking about whether we are not too narrowly focused on financial services. And we know that there's a lot of discussion on financial services for what, why, which Leonard also alluded to in his observation. So just to be short about this, my question is, as a challenge to the CGAP team, is, okay, financial health can be a process, but it's actually an outcome in our view, and which is very similar to financial well-being. In a way, I know we have different approaches from different institutions on this, but is there a way to look at customer outcomes that sort of linked to economic well-being, social well-being, and financial well-being? And is financial well-being in a way a proxy for the other two, or can we construct it like that? Because the big challenge is to see whether we can start doing things that look at what adds value to customers' lives broadly through financial services and facilitated by financial services, rather than looking at financial services as the end result or access and use. So that was just a consideration here, and I know I'm not answering anything, I'm just raising more questions.
That's really interesting. I mean, if I could just keep you on the line, Gerard, it sounds like CGAP is kind of thinking about financial health as one of a number of outcomes, with economic, social, and financial well-being being the three, buckets that outcomes fit into. I have the same, so it sounds like you have a similar causal relationship hypothesis that you're exploring. And I have the same question for you that I asked Leonard. What are the noisy things in that causal process? Gosh, I wish I had like a whiteboard to work off of right now. But what are the things that complicate that causal relationship? And as you explore and promote and get buy-in for this idea of financial services leading to economic, social, and financial well-being, what are the things that get in the way of your ability to make that argument? Like, are there systemic or microeconomic factors that complicate that relationship?
You ask such difficult questions, Sonia. We are looking at a piece of work where we actually want to understand those outcomes and see whether we can have a measurement or proxy indicators at the provider level that says, if we do these things, we will add value and we will reach these outcomes, without measuring the outcomes on a daily basis or in an expensive way. So we are thinking exactly about those causal relationships and whether there are ways in which to measure that. And I'll tell you where our thinking is going, because if you think about the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK and the South African Financial Services Board, it now has a new name because they've got Twin Peaks, a regulatory regime on the go there. They speak about treating customers fairly, and they want to drive a process where financial service providers are then not going to be measured in terms of all the sort of compliance tick the box or risk-based measurements, but in terms of whether they've actually added value to customers' lives. And we say, well, that's a difficult thing. We will have to work on, because we think it's a good notion to be outcomes driven rather than tick the box driven. But it's a good notion to think about it. But how do we think about it, and how do we measure this? And can we measure this by use, as Leonard is sort of arguing, or is there any evidence that says that use links to, or continuous use or more use links to better value, links to better outcomes, and are those outcomes only financial? So they are giving you, in a nutshell, what we are thinking about. So our work will first look at financial well-being, financial health, financial capability, and say which of these can we use in our formula, okay? And then we will also look at is there a pragmatic way in terms of how we can get proxy or indicative measures to actually guide us along this way, so that we don't have to go and do massive impact studies, because no financial service provider will do that anyhow. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
So this is Beth, and I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on the difference between the role of research and the role of measurement and monitoring. And so if we are thinking about understanding what contributes to financial health, and you know, I think we'll learn a lot that's very relevant for the delivery of financial services. The more we know about how people are or are not financially healthy, the more we'll be able to shape support to help them be more healthy. But I really can't see, I see that as a research question and a design question. It's a learning question. It's not a monitoring question. And when you look at monitoring, you just have to stick with things that are easy to monitor, or else you're in a morass and you're lost and you will never succeed. And so I would definitely go for usage as the best way to monitor success. And you just have to make sure that those usage targets have some kind of a theory of change behind them that connects them to financial health.
Am I still unmuted?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Yeah, Bev, I totally agree with you. But if you think about use, and you have to be careful about this, because I can use digital credit and I can use it a lot and I can be in big trouble. So exactly, that's that sort of hypothesis that you have behind it that I'm trying to think about here. And if you go into a financial service provider and you look at use and different patterns of use, are there different types of use that actually signal a better outcome of using a specific product or portfolio of products, or are they use users that give you no indication? For example, if you say that you are using, but you're only using once in every 90 days, are you really using? And if you are using and it is a systems initiated use or transaction, what does that mean versus a customer initiated use or transaction? So you are right, there are so many questions around this, and we want to look at that and see whether we can see any sort of nugget or diamond in the fogginess around this.
Yeah, it's really interesting to be at the beginning of the deployment of this concept of financial health, because it seems like we're sort of trying to do everything at once, but there's also sort of we're moving forward with it while we're trying to understand it, and I wonder if there's sort of a chicken and the egg problem here. Gerard, we're going to have another time of discussion a little bit later on in the hour, and so for the sake of wanting to get more voices in the conversation,
absolutely,
I'm going to turn now to Sarah Morgenstern, who is from Omidyar. She has a hard stop at around 10 a.m. So I'm going to open up the line to her, and then wanted to alert Priscilla Standridge from Gallup. Priscilla, you are on deck. So let me turn to Sarah Morgenstern first. Sarah, are you? Can you test your sound with us? Sarah, I'm afraid we're not hearing you. We've unmuted you from our end, but it doesn't look like you it doesn't look like we can hear you, or it doesn't sound like we can hear you anyway.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Oh, terrific. Okay, thanks. Good morning, all, and thank you so much for coordinating this conversation. As someone who's wrestling with these issues on a day-to-day basis, it's incredibly gratifying and helpful to hear everyone else thinking through the same set of issues. Just very briefly, at the Omidyar Network Financial Inclusion Team, I focus specifically on the US geography, and our work is very much informed by the piece of research CFSI had done back in 2015 that showed that 57% plus of US households struggled with financial health, which really reinforced the notion of this being a mass market challenge. And as we thought about how can we help contribute to alleviating that problem, we thought about both what are the demand side drivers of poor financial health and what are the supply side drivers. And on the demand side, there's an incredibly gnarly mix of intergenerational poverty, the move towards low wage and variable work, the housing crisis, consumerism, right? So wanted to recognize there's an enormously complex set of issues that feed into it from that perspective. Where we decided to start was to say, hey, in addition to all of that, from a supply side point of view, all too often right now, financial service products exacerbate rather than mitigate financial health challenges. And as a first step, can we attempt to reverse that dynamic, right? And so strive to make the supply side as responsive to consumers' financial health needs as possible. So that's one set of thoughts that we went through. And then against that supply side focus, most of what we do is early stage seed Series A investments in for-profit companies, and we've organized our for-profit investment theses around the pillars of financial health. So when we talk with entrepreneurs and they say, what do you guys invest in? We say, well, it's the three pillars. So day-to-day cash flow management, the basic blocking and tackling of cash flow in, cash flow out. How do we make sure that those two things stay in alignment in a world of increasing income volatility and expense shocks?
And Sarah, can I ask you for an example of a company?
Sure. I can give you 4 quick examples, and then I'm so sorry I do have to hop at 10 a.m. But I so look forward to it.
I think just one will be sufficient for the sake of time.
Okay, sounds good. We have an investee called Propel, which is a cash flow management app for food stamp recipients. And these guys help, there are 45 million people in the US on food stamps. It helps them to check their balance. And just that sheer fact of having greater insight into their cash flows, Harvard research demonstrated allows food stamp recipients to extend their benefits by on average 2 days per month. So that's an example of how real-time information delivered when someone's going to the grocery store lets them make better choices that have real effects on how they manage their day-to-day cash flows, and in turn affects economic security and food security.
That's great, and it's great to have a solid example, because our conversation so far this morning has been really focused on the higher level causal chains and theories. So it's great to hear how you're deploying this and actually using these hypotheses in your investment. So I know you have to run, but would love to follow up with you afterwards. And if anybody else wants to follow up with Sarah, please feel free to be in touch with us, and we can ask her if we can make an introduction. I'd love to turn now to Priscilla Strandridge from Gallup. Priscilla, I can't even believe that you had time to join us, because I know that you're doing a lot of data cleanup on a big financial health and wellness survey, and I'm not sure if that's what you wanted to weigh in with, but please, we've taken you off mute. Can you test your sound for us?
Yes, can you hear me? I apologize. I'm between meetings, and so I think it might be a bit noisy.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
Awesome. So I'm so excited that I did join today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel like such a newbie with all of these incredibly experienced people on the line, but I am super excited to sort of tell you about what Gallup is trying to contribute to these very clear problems that you're talking about, this chicken and the egg situation, this question of is it research, is it measurement? And what we tried to do was we tried to contribute Gallup's expertise on just developing great surveys that work cross-nationally. So we created a survey that includes a lot of those topics that you're talking about. It includes both the perception, both the usage, the well-being, and also the demographics, the household income, the household composition. We even included personality traits. We included different aspects about people's experience with remittances and different types of income. So what we really hope to contribute is an incredible database that will be released publicly on the 16th during our event so that people can start testing these questions in a way that I don't think has been possible necessarily. We did include 10 countries from around the world, and we also have a sample size of over 15,000 people. So that, I think, allows for a lot of these questions to start being tested, a lot of this research to start being developed. And it is not a measurement tool. That's a really great point, Beth, because we are trying to test those research questions as opposed to something that can just be thrown into an app or used from day one to measure things. We're really trying to look at this holistically so that people can narrow down what the various important factors and what those connections are.
Thanks, Priscilla. That's really helpful, and thank you for making time for us in between whatever it is you have going on this morning. And yeah, so that event, it sounds like, is public at Gallup on the 16th. So if you're in DC or can get to DC, CFI would be happy to, I mean, since you're in touch with us already, would be happy to forward that invitation on, or, you know, if you want to be connected to Priscilla directly, she's super busy cleaning up that data and writing the report now, but I'm sure she'd love to be in touch with folks about that event or about her research. So feel free to reach out. We're happy to facilitate that. It's funded by a friend of ours, MetLife, as well, who I think is also on the line. Great to hear about that, Priscilla. Thank you, and good to hear how you're operationalizing that concept. There are a couple other people who've raised their hands and have contributed some thoughts to us specifically here in the office, comments that are really helpful and I think would be great contributions to this discussion. I'd love to pause our discussion though, because I think this is a really good time, since we're talking about measuring financial health, the determinants of financial health. I think this is a really good time to turn to the researchers that we have on the line. And if I could ask you in Colombia to turn on your webcam, let me introduce our I guess, presenters today. We've got Jan Sebastian Cardenas from the Financial Superintendents of Colombia, Paula Cuadros Sierra from the Central Bank of Colombia, Catalina Estrada Mejia from Universidad de los Andes, and Diana Mejia from CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America. They have written a piece that I think is it's really impressive to me, because I've only started thinking about financial health in the last couple of years, and they are already deploying the concept and measuring it and using it to compare countries, which I think is really impressive. The work that they're going to be presenting is in the handout section of your webinar platform. It's the third one down. I can see your webcam, so it's the technology seems like it's working, and we've put the abstract up there. But we're going to turn over to you there in the CAF offices in Colombia, the ability to share your screen so that you can walk us through your presentation. And let me turn it over to you now in Colombia. Thanks.
Okay. Can you all see my screen at the moment?
Yep, we can see it just fine.
Okay. Can you also see us or not?
Yeah, you all look so good today.
Thank you. Super.
Yep. Okay.
So let me close here so you don't have to see this. Okay, good morning, everyone. We are very happy to have this opportunity to share these results with you. this is very much work in progress. So all the comments that you have and suggestions are very welcome. I know you already say our names, but now you can see us on the screen. Here on my right, I have Sebastian, Paola, and Diana, and I'm Catalina. We start this project because we have a deep passion for understanding what are the drivers of financial well-being and to how can we help consumers to make better financial decisions. And what you're going to see in this presentation is, so we have two main objectives with this project. And the first objective is to measure financial well-being for 7 different countries in Latin America. And with this measurement, we can compare the countries and we can learn from those comparisons. And the second objective was to understand better the determinants behind that different score, the determinants behind financial well-being, to understand why we find differences in the scores. So our first task, sorry, I can pass it. Oops. Yeah.
It's working.
So the first task was to develop an index to measure financial well-being for Latin America. And looking through the research that has been done, we found this paper published last year by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in which they developed a very comprehensive definition of financial well-being. And with comprehensive, I mean that they not only have a general definition, but also the components that you need to measure or that can be measured to have a final score. So here on the first column, you see the components that they propose. So the first one is control over day-to-day, month-to-month finances. And what this means is that they argue that people with high financial well-being are people that know how much they have, they know how much they have to pay, and they control their finances. So they are never in the position of saying, oh, I don't have enough money to survive. So they know how much they can spend. The second component is the capacity to absorb a financial shock. And this speaks to the capacity of the person to cope with unexpected financial circumstances. So imagine you have an accident and then you have to repair your car or you have to repair your house. So people that have high financial well-being are able to cope with that situation and to recover from that shock. So they might have savings or they might have a safe net that help them with the family or with friends that help them to cope with that moment. The third one is the financial freedom to make choices to enjoy life. And I really like this component because it really speaks to what is important for human beings. So we want to be able to do the things that we like and to enjoy the activities that we like. So if you want to go to dinner one day, if you want to buy a present for your kid or your wife, then you have the opportunity to do that. And I think this is part of what we were talking before about to add value to the customer side. And the fourth component is on track to meet financial goals. And here they ask consumers whether they feel that they are taking the right steps towards being able to achieve those financial goals. So those goals are, for instance, buying a car or buying a house or paying for your education. So having this framework, what we did was to use the CAP's financial capability survey that inquires about financial capabilities, and we understood that as knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior regarding financial issues. And we search for questions that best fit each element of the first column. So you see, for instance, if you look at the first line, so for this component of control over day-to-day, we have questions such as, I pay my bills on time, or before buying something, I consider carefully if it can pay for it. Or the last one, track to meet financial goals, we have questions such as, I set long-term saving goals and I strive to achieve them. So after selecting the questions, we calculate the index using a graded response model. And for those who are not familiar with this technique, it's no more than an extension from a traditional item response theory with two parameters. But the advantage of this technique is that it allows us to include questions with ordered categorical answers. If you have questions about this, please let us know, and we can go more in detail about the estimation. So we have the questions, we calculate the index. For the sake of interpretation, we did a transformation. So now the minimum score is 0 and the maximum score is 100. And let's see what we found. So this is our first result. So we forgot to mention the countries that we're going to be talking about: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. So in the first graph, if you look at the first graph, then we have the average score per country. And we see that Chile and Colombia, they have very high scores. If you see, for instance, Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay, they have the lowest score in this sub-region of countries. And in the last bar, we have the average. Here we are talking about the average of this sub-region. It's an aggregated of the countries, which is 59. If you go to the other graph, to the graph on your right, we set the mean to 0. And what we see here is that Chile and Colombia are doing relatively well in this sub-region, while Argentina and Paraguay are facing greater financial challenges in the region. Remember that the maximum score is 100. So now the second question, or our second goal, was to try to understand the factors that explain these differences. And so what we're going to see here is the association between the financial well-being score and a host of different variables about individual characteristics, about family characteristics, income, behaviors, and others. So here you find our first result. So what we have is that financial well-being is positively related with education. So people with technical or university degree had a higher score than participants with only a high school degree. At the aggregate level, this difference is between 5 points, so it goes from 63 to 58. However, we did a second analysis and was to compare the distributions of the different subcategories. So let me walk you through this graph. So if you see at the bottom of the screen, you have the index that goes from 0 to 100. And then on the y-axis, you're going to have 4 categories of education: less than high school, technical education, and university. And what we observe in most countries is a medium to high overlap between these distributions. So what this means is that there are participants or people in these countries with less than a high school that have similar scores than participants with a high school or a technical education. So what we think is that these people are using money managing strategies that allow them to have high scoring financial well-being, although they don't have enough education. We have the same, I want to show you here, these are the graphs for the other countries, and we find similar results. We go now to income, and it shouldn't be a surprise for you that financial well-being is related with income. So people or participants here with low income had on average a financial well-being score of 63, medium income 59, and high income 65. However, using this analysis of comparing the distributions, what we found is a medium to high overlap across income subgroups in all countries. So this is one of the main contributions on this paper, and is this idea that even if you are in a disadvantaged position and you have low income, you can still work and have strategies that allow you to have well-being, like financial well-being. We can also imagine someone, for instance, that has a very high income, but he's paying for a very expensive car, a very expensive house, he has many credit cards that he can pay. Then although this person has a high income, he's probably in financial distress, and his financial well-being is probably very low. Here we have the same graphs for the other countries in the analysis, and we have the same results. So medium to high overlap among these subgroups. Now we go to savings. And what we find here is that individuals with formal saving products had an average and score of 66, who was 10 points higher than those individuals with no formal savings. So having the opportunity or the option to have access to formal savings is very important to achieve a high score in financial well-being. And let me jump ahead to this slide where we have financial well-being and credit cards. So this is whether the person has a formal borrowing products like a credit card. And here we see that if you have a credit card, it's associated with a high financial well-being, but this is only 5 points higher than those with no credit cards. So what we see here is that it appears that at least for Latin America, not having access to savings, to formal saving products is more harmful for your financial well-being than not having access to credit. We find here, this is interesting with what Leonard was saying before about a different subgroup. And we have the same graphs. And finally, this is something that we have called good financial practices. And with this, we mean activities or behaviors that people can do to inform their decision-making process. So we're going to talk about 4. The first is whether they compare financial institutions before acquiring a new product, whether they search for information in printed media or by phone or online advertising, whether they search for information in asking advice for non-financial experts. So you ask your friend, you ask your coworker, or you use also your previous experience. And the last behavior is whether they search for expert advice, if they go to a financial advisor before acquiring a new product. And let me walk you through this table. So the numbers that you see in green or red, so it means that there is a significant difference between the population that say yes and the population that say no. If the number is in black, then we couldn't find a statistically significant difference. So let's go to the first column that says global. This is the country aggregate for the 7 countries. And what we see is that indeed people that compare financial institutions have a higher financial score than those who did not compare it. And sorry, I forgot to say that in the parentheses, we have the standard deviation. So we have the mean and the standard deviation. And so going back to my idea, so if you look at the first column, you see that indeed people who compare these financial institutions before acquiring a new product, people that search for information, the people that ask for advice to non-financial experts or to experts report a higher financial well-being score than those who are not doing those activities. What we think is important here is that these practices or these activities can be taught to the consumers. We can teach people to do this. So let me wrap up with summarizing the results and some recommendations from this work. So the first contribution that we want to make with this paper is that Financial Wellbeing Index provides information that goes beyond traditional financial measures. For instance, wealth, measure of wealth. Because with the index, we can identify groups of people that even if they are in a relatively disadvantaged position, we find that they are using or they can use strategies that allow them to increase their financial well-being. We cannot increase the income of everybody, but we can teach people how to manage well their income. And the second result that for Latin America we think is very important is this finding that not having or not using formal products for saving might be more harmful to your financial well-being than not having access to formal credit. We find also that high levels of financial knowledge are associated with greater financial well-being. So we encourage the institutions also to keep investing in financial education, but we propose in more detail that these interventions should be focused on changing the behavior of people, to use teachable moments, to use learning by doing or nudge, for instance. I think before, if I'm not mistaken, Laura was talking about some of these strategies that they're using in United States. And finally, we find that these financial practices, these behaviors, simple behaviors, are key variables that explain financial well-being for this population. And the importance here is that we can teach people to do this, or we can develop policies that ask the institution, the financial institutions, to present the information in such a way that is easier for the consumers to compare the different options. I'm going to stop here and we open the floor for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Catalina. Again, I really like that you're moving forward with implementing financial health and measuring it in context. I think this is really impressive research, and this is exactly the right group to present it to. The folks that are on the line are ones who can learn from this and use it in their own work, and who also might have questions. Just as a time check, I recognize that we said we were going to end at 30 minutes past the hour. We have one item of business to take care of, and that is to just run down a list of a few things that have been happening in the financial health space this year so far, or at least since our last meeting, which was in January, and things we can look forward to. I'd like to save about 5 minutes for those things, but I think that responding to this research and having a conversation takes priority. And so I am planning on extending this call an extra 15 minutes. I totally understand if you have to drop off. We will be following up with a recording of this and also sharing some of these resources that we will be discussing. So I'm going to leave some space now for response and continuing the conversation that we started nearly an hour ago before we turn to sort of the business items. So just wanted to give that time check and that quick overview of where we're going from here. I'd like to turn to Francis Sinha, who had a question about household versus individual. And there is a very specific and narrow measurement question there about how to measure financial health and what the unit of analysis is. But I think there's a larger question behind Francis's comment about household versus individual, about the drivers of financial health. Francis, I know you have some connectivity issues. Can you test your sound with us? Can you try to speak?
Hello, everybody. Hello.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Great, and a very interesting presentation. I'm really interested to see the way the team have, as you say, made more concrete these questions around financial capability. I find that really useful. I think there are probably other things to discuss, but maybe there's not enough time left on this call, except to say that what I find is when I look at indexes, is it's often interesting to look not only at the average scores that come out, but to look at the different components of the index. And it might be interesting, if you've perhaps already done that, to understand on these different elements whether you see differences and more insights around the issues that are making a difference to the score. And then the other point, of course, which I had raised in the chat box, is this question of whether we are looking at the financial health of individuals or whether we are looking at the financial health of households. Certainly in the Asian context, I find when I look at the research around this is that there's quite a lot of, there's sometimes maybe underlying assumptions that it's either one or the other, and then one wonders, well, actually, should it not be a combination of both? So I think, as Sonia, you were saying, it's partly, yes, how do we measure, but also indeed what are the drivers and the factors at the household level. So I'd be really interested to understand how others are looking at this question, whilst recognizing that I'm sure there are differences in different cultural contexts.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn to Catalina just because she's on the line for that, to respond to that, but also would love to throw that question out to the rest of you who are listening. Household versus individual, not just on the measurement of financial health, but also on the determinants of financial health. Are we talking about household level factors, or can financial health be measured at an individual level? I know there are a lot of you still on the line who have wrestled with this question, but first let me turn to Catalina.
Francis, thank you very much for your questions. And in the first question about the different components, you are right. We haven't done the analysis yet, but we're going to do it very soon to see which of these components is more important, let's say, to explain the financial well-being. We will let you know what we find, and we agree with you that it's a very important analysis for the index. And the second question is, at least in this research, we are measuring at the individual level. So the questions that were asked at the individual level, like, with your income, what do you do? What are the activities that you are doing? So we think it's possible to measure at the household level, but for this work, it was done at the individual level.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Catalina. If there are any other folks who are on the line who would like to weigh in on that question, feel free to raise your hand by pressing the hand icon, or put a comment in the chat window. I know there are others who've also wrestled with this, because on a very practical level, it's so much more clean and easy to ask about the individual. But from the standpoint of understanding influencers in an individual's life, the household is critically important. So the findings about education level and income level are indeed heavily influenced by households. One of the things that we at CFI found when we were working on, and we have been working on financial capability, is that that somebody doesn't have to actually know a lot to be financially capable. Maybe they're around people who have a habit of saving, and they just do so sort of because of their influencers. Or on the flip side, maybe they don't have good models around them, and so even if they have a high level of education, they might not understand the value of putting money aside for emergencies. So yeah, that is something that we've struggled with at CFI as well. I'd love to call now on Paul Nelson from USAID. Paul, can you test your sound for us? We've just taken you off of mute here. I think, great. Yeah, Paul, can you keep, sorry, can you keep talking, test your sound here? Like, we're trying to take you off of mute. We accidentally, sorry, just full disclosure, we accidentally took the wrong person off of mute. So apologies to one of you who, Paul, can you, sorry, we took you off of mute, but it doesn't seem like your sound is working from our end. And if Yeah, so if we don't get you on the line here, we're just going to keep trying. But while we're trying, I'm going to just read your question. Thank you for putting it in the chat box. So Paul asked, did you get any sense of the influence on well-being of informality or the commingling of business and household activities? You know, certainly that is, those are big factors in Latin America. And so I'm curious to hear what you found, Catalina, et al.
Thanks, Sonia. I'm now unmuted, but I'll just pass over to the colleagues for the question.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'm glad we got it figured out. Go ahead, Catalina.
Hi, if I understood your question, so with informality, what we have is whether they were using informal saving or informal credit, and we find that they both have an influence on financial well-being. So having a formal saving product and having an informal saving product, they both have a positive effect on financial well-being, but the effect of having a formal saving product is 6 times higher than having an informal saving product. And interestingly, this pattern is reversed for Argentina. So in Argentina, having an informal saving product is more determinant for financial well-being than a formal saving product. Yes. Is this what you were asking?
Thank you. Just to reword my comment, that is helpful. I think I was thinking about informality insofar as people, particularly even in Argentina, there's a level of informality in terms of commingling of business and household financial activities, and whether there was any apparent influence on that type of behavior on people's financial well-being.
No, we didn't have, let's say, measures of that. However, in the questions we asked, people were asked, thinking in all the activities that you do, let's say, how much income do you make, like from working in this company or from working outside. So they could also report their income of this, how do you were saying, these informal like activities. But we didn't have a measure exactly of how much.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, CAF survey have some questions regarding the kind of jobs that the people have. And for example, formal sector or informal sector or part-time labor. But unfortunately, the way that the questions are included or are asked are not the same. They don't allow us to make comparisons for the 7 countries. I mean, we do have these kind of questions, and we can have the analysis for each country, but we didn't include it in the paper because it don't allow us to have the same comparison for the 7 countries.
That's helpful. I know that we have others on the line who have dealt with this question of informality. It's something that CFSI is thinking about in the U.S. context, and we have Thea Garon on. I'm so sorry, Thea, I don't know how to say your last name, but thinking about the gig economy, and I know that's not always the informal sector, but thinking about informality in the context of the predictability of income and variability of income streams. And I believe so Thea, we're trying to unmute you right now, but oh, great. We just did on our end. I'm not sure if you can. Oh, great. We can hear you.
You guys can hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for teeing me up. So indeed, informality is something that CFSI has spent the last few years or so looking at, primarily through our U.S. financial diaries research. This was a deep dive ethnographic study where we tracked the financial lives of 250 households across America, across the country, really looking at all of their inflows and their outflows. And one of the primary findings from that research was the fact that households have incredibly volatile income, far more volatile, far more variable than I think any of us really ever imagined, which is important because as we think about the social determinants of financial health, this income volatility, and I'm thinking about the research that Catalina and her colleagues presented, income volatility can really be an exacerbating circumstance. You can have a relatively high income, you can have low income, but this income volatility is a factor that will make it that much harder to maintain financial stability, to maintain financial health. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We are indeed looking at how income volatility plays in the gig economy. It's just something that we have realized is an important factor in financial health and one that we'll continue to pay attention to in the coming years.
That's great. And we're going to be shifting in just a minute to talk about things that have been happening in the financial health space over the last few months. While we still have you off of mute, Thea, do you want to talk a little bit about the project that CFSI has taken on to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So the project that Sonia is referencing is the U.S. Financial Health Pulse. It's a brand new research project that we've just launched about a month or two ago at this point. And we see this research as building upon the foundation of research that we've released in 2015. It was our first attempt to assess the financial health of the country. Sarah Morgenstern referenced this research earlier in her remarks. We found that 57% of the country was struggling. So with this U.S. Financial Health Pulse, we want to again build on the foundation that we released in 2015, and we are aiming to conduct research and release it on an ongoing basis. We see this study being a rigorous, widely publicized, ongoing piece of research that's really designed to benefit the entire financial health ecosystem, primarily in the U.S., but we hope that there are positive externalities on a global level as well. And so we see financial service providers using insights from this research to design new products, policymakers and regulators using their insights and the data and the research to design smart regulation. And we certainly hope that media thought leaders and others reference this research alongside other indices of consumer well-being across the country. And we're really excited about this research because in many ways it really is the first of its kind. It's a holistic look at financial health, so it goes beyond looking at issues of access and inclusion to the holistic framing of financial health. Since we are intending to release this research on an annual basis, we've secured 3 years of grant funding for the first 3 years, but we see this study lasting far beyond the first 3 years of the grant. So since we do intend to release it on an annual basis, this research will cover ongoing trends. But what's really exciting, and I think what really makes this unique and first of its kind, is the fact that we'll be combining both survey and transactional data. So we're working with a group out of the University of Southern California to collect survey data, similar to what Catalina presented, building a survey index of financial health, but we'll also be partnering with the university to collect transactional data records on these individuals that will be able to marry insights from the self-reported survey data with the observed, somewhat more objective transactional data, really breaking new ground there. Thrilled about that aspect of the research. And let me just conclude by saying that we are extremely grateful for the support of our funders. We've secured 3 funders, Omidyar Network, again represented by Sarah Morgenstern, who you heard from earlier, MetLife Foundation, as well as AARP.
Great, thanks, Thea. Again, time check. We have about 4 minutes left, and I said I wanted to leave space for folks to share about what's been happening so far this year since our last meeting in January. But thank you so much to Jan, Paula, Catalina, and Diana for sharing your research. It was a pleasure to see that, and this is, like I said, exactly the right group to be thinking about it. It is in the handout section, but we will also send it out afterwards. So if anybody else has any questions or comments, this is something that they are circulating for publications, and so they are continuing to think about implications and taking comments on it. So feel free to direct those to us or directly to them as well. if you have any additional thoughts. Thank you so much to the team in Colombia. You can feel free to turn off your webcam if you want to, or you can keep it on. And I just saw you came off mute. You can go ahead and share any final words you have.
No, thank you, and thank you all for inviting to this webinar to present these results. We are, as I said before, if you have comments or suggestions, please let us know. Yeah. This is work in progress, and we want to share these results, and we can do more analysis like the things that you have suggested. And we're very happy to be part of this group.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Great, thank you so much. So before we conclude, we've put up this list of reports and initiatives that have come out in the last few months, recognizing that it's not exhaustive. But if any of you on the line represent any one of these initiatives, we would welcome you to share a little bit about them. They are all available at the link that we've posted here, which I understand is not clickable, but it's bit.ly/FinHealthResources, and there you can see all of those resources, and also both the reports and the press release. I still hear you, Diana. If you could go on mute, that would be great. From our perspective, I wanted to point out a publication that we put out jointly with Microfinance Center of Poland with funding from MetLife Foundation called Toward Financial Health, a Tool for Consumers. We have the report there in the handout section. This is building on our initial insights as part of a 3-year project that aims to measure, track, and improve the financial health of consumers working with their financial service providers. So I wanted to point that out. If there's anybody on the line who represents any of these others, feel free to raise your hand and I'd be happy to call on you to share about them, but I recognize that you may have moved on or are multitasking and doing other things. But Good Shepherd Microfinance has done this really interesting study looking at the financial well-being of consumers in Australia and the financial well-being of consumers in New Zealand. And those reports, we've put up the Australia ones in the handout section, but the New Zealand one is also available in that resources list at the link that's down at the bottom of the slide there. And then Maria Jose Roa and her colleagues at SEMLA, based in Mexico City, have done some work on financial decisions and financial capabilities in the Andean region. And that is focused on financial capability, but really looking at behaviors with a direct impact on financial health. So that is worth looking at as well. And Maria is on the line. If you, it looks like, Maria, I can see that you are probably multitasking, but if you would like to share anything about that, feel free to raise your hand. We also heard today about the May 16th event at Gallup, and I'd like to underline that. It's the Gallup World Poll did a survey within 10 countries looking at financial health and well-being, piloting a huge bank of questions, but selecting the ones that they felt were the most consistent and had explanatory value. And so that event, the research funded by MetLife Foundation, will be at Gallup headquarters here in Washington, D.C. on May 16th. If anybody would like an invitation to that. And then we also heard about the CFSI work as well. So, oh, and Central Bank of Brazil as well. I know that you folks, the Central Bank of Brazil, are not on the line right now, but they have some really interesting work to do a national level survey of financial health, and have done a lot of due diligence to make sure that their survey asks the right questions, and they're going to use it to track financial health over time of Brazilians. That is really interesting too, and I know we're in touch with the folks at the Central Bank of Brazil, but are happy to make introductions if the folks there would be interested, as I know that they're reaching out to ask some questions about the work that they're doing. So that's the long list of things that have been happening in the financial health space this year so far. Thanks to all who sent in questions and comments. I recognize that we're about 15 minutes over, but wanted to conclude by saying thank you so much for sticking with us. I know this was a slightly longer call than we promised. We will be following up with these documents and the recording so that you can share it with folks in your network. Like I said at the beginning, this is sort of an ad hoc group, but it is very targeted towards folks in the financial health space. We meet every 3 or 4 months. So if you have somebody you think should be included on the list, please feel free to send them our way. And we'd love to include them. Or if you have any suggestions on this forum, we'd love to hear those as well, recognizing that you know, this started as sort of an informal gathering and has grown, and we want it to be as useful as possible to folks in the space. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world. Thanks.